You're listening to the Mind Over Finger podcast, episode number 21.
Welcome to the Mind Over Finger podcast, discussions on mindful music making, efficient practice, and building a purposeful career. And now, your host, Dr. Renee Paul Gauthier.
Hi, everyone. I hope you're having a wonderful week so far. Before we launch in the episode, I want to take a minute to give a huge shout out to my wonderful producer, Bella Kelly, who works so hard to make me and my guests sound our very best. This podcast would not be possible without her, and I'm so grateful that she's part of the team. So thank you, Bella. Last week, I spoke with pianist David Jalbert about finding yourself as an artist, the importance of confidence in our progress, and about some tips on how to learn and memorize music. And today, I speak with Dr. Immanuel Abraham, violinist, composer, and creator of Facebook's most popular bowed string forum, the Violin Guild, which comprises over 30,000 members worldwide. Immanuel graduated Summa Cum Laude from the University of Michigan and the University of Arizona with degrees in Violin Performance, and he has earned numerous awards and recognitions. In addition to this, he is a sought-after composer, and his most recent commissions have included complete scores for theatrical works, string quartets, and the Abraham 24 Caprices for Solo Violin, which have premiered in 3 countries. Immanuel has performed across the world and has been featured on CBS Detroit, BuzzFeed, and Fiddlerman's exclusive blog series, Music is for Everyone. In this fascinating conversation, Immanuel talks to us about his unorthodox path to a professional career and all things mindful and efficient practice. He also talks about the importance of learning to compose and enhancing your performance on your instrument. I find his story very compelling, and I know for a fact that Immanuel's passion and incredible dedication for his art will inspire and motivate you. Let's go to the show. Immanuel Abraham, so great to have you on the show today.
Thank you for having me. I'm really grateful. Really grateful to be on the show. Grateful to talk to you. Love your program. Everything that you've had on it, I learned from it. So thank you for that. And I'm honored to be a guest.
Immanuel, I first heard about you after joining the Violin Guild's Facebook group, which you run, and I've loved following your activities ever since, and I'm having a lot of fun as a member of this group. I'm excited that we're going to get to talk about efficient practice, so let's get right to it. But before, I'd like us to start with knowing more about you. So can you please tell us about you and your musical journey and how you got to where you are and how your artistic path has unfolded?
Sure. I guess I'll start with my inspiration, what made me want to play the violin in the first place. I had what pretty much everyone in the classical world considers a late start. I started my musical studies at the age of 14, um, and so I didn't play violin or anything else before that. I started at 14, and I knew immediately that this is what I wanted to do with my life. And I had no idea what I was getting into. But but I knew that this was something that I enjoyed, and the inspiration for violin in particular came from a version of Sesame Street. So Sesame Street has some spin-off versions in other countries where they integrate language and cultural learning. Like instead of just having your ABCs and your one, two, threes and some basic words and grammar, if they go to, say, Mexico, there's a version of Sesame Street there where uh, people can learn Spanish and English side by side. Uh, being raised as a Jew, I watched a version of Sesame Street called Shalom Sesame, and it just so happens that in Tel Aviv, Israel, Israel's second most populous city, I believe, There's a town called Tel Aviv, and in Tel Aviv, there's a street called Rehov Sumsum. In Hebrew, that means Sesame Street. Now, Tel Aviv itself is also the hometown of the one and only Itzhak Perlman. And
Mm-hmm.
so Itzhak Perlman had been a regular guest on this show. And of course, being Perlman, he made the violin look cool and easy, and only one of which was turned out to be correct in the end. It's very cool. And so I started asking to play the violin from a relatively young age, but I grew up as one of 12 siblings, and most of my family was crammed in a small 2-bedroom apartment, so there's not really practice space or even space to hear yourself think. But I kept asking to play the violin, and when I was 14, there was an ad in a newspaper offering a free violin lesson at the Merit School of Music in Chicago, and they'd let you borrow a violin for a few weeks. And so, I begged to do that. I went, studied, I got my first lesson there. And after a short while, I worked really hard at it and convinced my folks to invest in allowing me to continue to study music. And so, shortly after that, I needed to get an instrument. And my first violin that I owned came from the Salvation Army. It was it was in a pillowcase. I had 3 strings, and I didn't know enough about the violin to know a good violin from a bad violin. It was just a violin. And so that was one of the challenges that was faced, was the age I had started and the monetary means of my family. The money just didn't allow me to start beginning to study music until I was 14. And after a year and a half, I was already saying, I have to do this for the rest of my life. This is just the best thing ever. And everything I was getting out of it, which I'll get into maybe later in the show, was just life changing for me on a minutely basis. Even my best and closest teachers were saying, this is, you're moving at a very quick pace, but everything you need to know about music at large to go for a degree in music, and for violin performance in particular, 4 years isn't really enough time to prepare for that. And so this was kind of a constant jab that I was getting that was propelling me forward, was the fear of not being able to continue this as my life and passion for the rest of my life.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was getting up before school, hours before school started, to practice. I get my hours in. During high school, I skipped every single lunch. I don't remember getting lunch once during high school. And I used all of that time to practice. I also lost a lot of weight because I wasn't eating lunch. I came to high school pretty pudgy, and but I lost that from skipping lunch for 4 years. um, and and after school, I was always the last one in the orchestra room practicing more. And the orchestra director actually gave me the keys to the orchestra room because I was the first one there in the mornings and the last one to leave. He knew he could rely on me to have the doors unlocked and open every day. And so that continued throughout high school. And there were a lot of programs and things that I joined in the meantime. But I'd like to move on to your other questions. But that was the impetus for what had started me with music and a bit of the motivation.
It's really incredible. What a wonderful story. So inspiring, of defying the odds and show what true determination can do. Really remarkable. And you mentioned the Merit School of Music, and I live in Chicago, and I have often the opportunity to go there for, various events. And I believe in their mission so much. This is such a truly incredible organization that has fostered talent of so many young kids that went on to become a professional. But even those who did not become professional musicians, it impacted their lives in so many ways, offering them a nurturing environment and stimulation and surroundings with faculty that really nurtures their gifts and their personalities. And I really wish that we saw more organizations like the Merit School everywhere.
Absolutely.
Let's continue this story because it's so fascinating. So you're there, and I think that any teacher would have told you at 14, forget it. There's no way you'll ever become a professional musician, especially playing the violin. There's this preconception that if you are not proficient by the time you're 7 years old, you will just never make it. But so you're there, and how did that happen for you to get into college? And tell us a little bit about your college journey.
Sure, absolutely. Well, first of all, that was the number one, like I said, the jab in the back. There's the strong and very popular and somewhat justified, but false idea in classical music that if you don't start as a fetus, you've missed the boat. You know, I was always trying to prove this wrong, and you're right. A lot of the instructors, people who had watched me, were still saying, this is just not enough time. Now, a lot of people who didn't know how long I'd been playing, even after 2 years, were saying, yeah, go for it. But the people who knew that it had only been 2 years of study at that point were just saying, no way. Even at the Merit School of Music, when I had first gone there, they had the rule that the best thing about the Merit School is their tuition-free conservatory program. In my opinion, that's just a lifesaver, especially for the underprivileged and underrepresented communities, which are many in Chicago. It allows an opportunity to study music with some of the best instructors in the city, and if you put the work in, it's tuition free. Being involved in a tuition free conservatory, and I became concertmaster of their symphony after it was my third year, and I was second in their concerto competition the same year. But at that point, I had also done so many other things. My goals were in music. I just took it all in wherever possible. So I had a huge program that had helped me and that I have a decade-long history with. Had been the Blue Lake Fine Arts Camp in Twin Lake, Michigan.
Mm-hmm.
And I played in a lot of youth symphonies throughout Chicago. The Oak Park Symphony, River Forest Symphony, um, Symphony from the Shorewood Academy, Chicago Cervantes. By my junior year, I'd gotten into the Chicago Youth Symphony. With that ensemble, I played under Alan Tinkham then, and but we had the CYMI that same year, and so I also got the opportunity to play and perform at Symphony Center under Gustavo Dudamel.
Wow.
And these were all programs where it just seemed, as long as I was putting in as many hours as felt humanly possible to put in on the violin, doors were opening that would never have opened any other way. When I was growing up, college wasn't a discussion. Again, I was one of 12 siblings, and most of my family was in a 2-bedroom apartment. This wasn't a discussion, but through Blue Lake, I joined their Masterworks program, Masterworks Orchestra my first year. That was where I played my first Tchaikovsky symphony. I remember it was Tchaikovsky's Sixth, and I played first violin for that. There was a lot of new things. I remember I had good interactions at the camp, loved everyone at the camp that I met, but I skipped as many social events as possible to actually learn my part. And there were positions and things that were required in the excerpts that I still had never encountered before at that point. The next year, though, I had auditioned for the International Youth Symphony, and that's a group that tours Europe for the better part of 2 months, and then they come back to the U.S. and have a mini homecoming tour. And the program then was it was expensive, and my whole family, extended family, and all came together. put the money together for me to go on this first tour. While I was on tour, and we played a lot of repertoire, Tchaik 4, Pictures at an Exhibition. I think we had Overture to Candide as an encore, other things on the program. But they had the deal that if you became concertmaster in that ensemble, you would tour for free. And for me, that chair seemed further away than the Orion constellation, but I knew that if there was any chance of going back, because this experience, it's my first time outside of the country. I dreamed of traveling, but again, the price of plane tickets and all of that, it just seemed another impossibility to be able to travel again. But it was so life changing. Stayed with host families rather than just like sitting in motels, and just learned so much about the culture, tried new foods, got immersed with different languages. The tours went through, the first year was Austria, France, Germany. I think we had one stop in Denmark also. Absolutely life changing. So I practiced so much that year. The excerpts that we had, musical literacy was a huge hurdle to jump, in addition to the violin technique itself. And I used to take my music and turn it upside down, read it backwards, put it on its side, practice reading it that way. I did everything possible with the music. I'd play notes from the end to the beginning. I think you commented on a post I made about doing that not too long ago with the Presto from Bach's first solo sonata, BWV 1001.
Mm-hmm.
How it still sounds good playing it completely backwards. And so I learned to read the music. I did that with the excerpts this way, and so I actually memorized all of my excerpts, and I was so confident by the time of the audition. I went in without the music, and it wasn't deliberate. I just, I'd been working on it so long without the music that I felt super comfortable with it. Now, there hadn't been high schoolers in that seat for except when the program first started. I believe they may have, but the seat had usually been held by a college student or a college graduate. And at the time that I did achieve first chair the next summer, I think I left off talking about the type of practice I had with those excerpts, literally learning them backwards, playing long passages with starting the notes from the far right and reading them going left. Anything to feel absolutely comfortable with the excerpt, any accident, blindfolded practice, you name it. I got super, super creative with ways to improve and ways to become a better player. So I got this chair, and I held that chair in the orchestra for 4 consecutive years into college. Alongside that, I participated in, I've been concertmaster of the Merit Symphony Orchestra, first violin, the Chicago Cervantes Sinfonietta, and I played first violin in the Symphony of Oak Park and River Forest, another wonderful, wonderful experience. And all of this, and I was still getting up and practicing before school, still skipping every lunch. I skipped both of my proms to practice. I skipped my own birthday parties because they're saying, okay, we're going to have a party for you. And I'm saying, I've got this thing coming up tomorrow. I really need to practice for that. Can't we just put the birthday thing off till next week, or just give me the presents now? And I hope one of them's some rosin.
And at this point, I know that numbers are irrelevant. It's all about the quality of practice too. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
numbers are not completely irrelevant, but just to give us a rough idea, how many hours a day do you say you were practicing at that time?
Oh, 6 would be a good estimate. And
Wow.
the and that's not at all a brag or a boast of any kind. I was not an efficient, smart practicer at that point. I can honestly say that. I got results, but I hadn't really realized the extent to which quality over quantity applies. I just knew what seemed to be working. I had these opportunities to travel, literally tour Europe every summer for 5 summers in a row. The summer after that, I got an invite to tour in Spain, in Lloret de Mar in Barcelona. But I started realizing that to play not only with that rate of output, but also certain levels of repertoire, I needed to have a more efficient practice regime. And I've heard you speak often about mindful practice. And if I can talk about mindful practice for a moment, is that okay with you?
Oh, absolutely.
So I really appreciate that you've devoted time on your social media and episodes to mindful practice, and you've asked people what is mindful practice? What does it look like in the practice room? And mindful practice is, I mean, it's a term that's used a lot in pedagogy. And I've found many to equate mindful practice with focused practice. And I think that's an error. Mindful and focused are two totally different adjectives in this case. Um, Mindful practice carries the directive of being aware. Focused more carries the directive of being undistracted. Um, and you can do a lot of things good and not so good for your playing while being undistracted from it. So it really doesn't equate with being uh, focused by itself.
That's an excellent point.
Thank you. I mean, you could be having a practice that's not productive at all and remain, unfortunately, completely undistracted. I call that zombie mode. You probably have a more elegant term for it, but That's what it feels like because I think we've all done that a bit. Um, and I call it zombie mode because going through your Kreutzer and your Rode and Daunt etudes, or especially something more potentially hypnotizing like Wolfart Opus 45 or Sevcik Opus 1 and 2, with bad posture or playing out of tune or not ever playing it with actual tempo. A lot of us do our Paganini work that way just because we stop at every other note. Um, I think we've all engaged in that somewhat. The easiest mistake for a musician to make, in my opinion and experience, is it's so easy to practice and get worse. I think this is really important to realize. Practice absolutely does not make perfect. And there's this trendy edit to that where they say, okay, only perfect practice makes perfect. And that's also not true. Why is it untrue? Because there's no such thing as perfect practice. That the very concept and the words are oxymoronic. If we had perfect practice, we would never have to practice, in the first place. Um, it's the Practice is the process of our imperfections, and going through those processes allows us to temper them uh, and to make them smaller. No one has ever played anything perfectly within an an absolute, a mathematical absolute definition of the word perfect. Um, and there are small things. I think every recording that's ever made of any piece, the artist would have something that they would have changed or made slightly different, or even very different in that recording. So that the concept of perfect practice uh, is entirely oxymoronic, in my opinion. Um, and we've all had what seemed like great practice days, then awake the next day, and we feel like we took the whole week off. It's like, what happened? Who messed me up in my sleep? I'm never going to go to sleep again if that happens. And so mindful practice is instead, of just being merely undistracted. Mindful practice is being aware of those things, both internal and external to us, especially habits that stymie our productive process of our imperfections. Um, and so, not going through things hypnotically. It's very easy to do with scales and etudes, and I've fallen into that. I've had 6 hour practice runs especially when I was younger, and just starting out, where I was trying to play um, 4 octave scales in tune, which after a couple of years was very um, I'd be very fortunate if the first octave were in tune. Um, but I was going through these and really just struggling to get it. And I put all this time in 6 hours, and I think I would have gotten more out of a half an hour doing it at a much slower tempo, realizing what was in tune and out of tune. Intonation as a string player is, in my opinion, is our number one, what we work on the most, technique-wise. And by far, it's one of very few instruments left in Western music that doesn't have anything marked. There's no button we can press or key to push down that guarantees the right pitch. And just mathematically speaking, we never play this exact same pitch twice. And it's kind of like if you imagine a piano, if the keys are all just one piece of wood, and each key is a different size, and then you still have to play Tchaikovsky's piano concerto with the keys in that kind of orientation. And that's what we get with the violin. After eighth or ninth position, a minor second is literally smaller than the space of the tip of our finger.
Mm-hmm.
And so we've got all these things to deal with, and I hadn't really stopped to think about, the fingerboard being like the solar system in reverse, everything getting closer and closer together as we go up. I was just more orientated on getting through the thing, and that was my goal. And I'd go at that for 6 hours. So it wasn't mindful. It was extremely focused, and it was not mindful at all. I was not aware of what was actually happening. I was aware of the input and not really aware of the actual output. And I had many days of practicing for 6 hours and feeling worse the next day.
Right. And I feel like for practice to be efficient, I think that the intention, the focus, and the awareness, they need to be locked on to the right target.
Exactly. And I can talk about a recording that changed. I'd heard teachers say practice slower. You need to practice slower. You need to lighten up. You need to not have all this pressure on the violin. I heard violinists who, heavy Israeli players like Pinka Zuckerman, who everything they did sounded just so rich and toneful, and I wanted to mimic that. And so I was putting a lot of muscle work into it, and not knowing that, the violin is really, you want the fewest muscles engaged possible at all times.
And when did that change for you?
That changed when I had an audition I went to the University of Michigan for undergrad and grad school. There was a year that the symphony was going to Carnegie Hall, and I wanted to be in the ensemble then. They had two ensembles, the Philharmonic and Symphony at the school. Symphony was the higher level ensemble, and I had 2 years in Philharmonic. And so I really wanted to get into symphony this term. And the excerpt that was bugging me is the popular Schumann Scherzo. And I got it up to tempo. I memorized it. I went through my old processes of being extremely focused, not mindful, um, and I was frustrated because I felt like I had the technique. I wasn't getting uh, tired, but it wasn't perfectly in tune. The articulations weren't perfectly even. Um, the tone and dynamics weren't always deliberate for every note, and I got very frustrated because at the level of that university, the players there, I knew that other people were achieving what I was having trouble with, and uh, I took a period. It was the longest period I had gone without playing at that point. It was a couple of weeks. It was over the summer, and because I felt depressed. I couldn't figure out what needed to change, and I listened that summer to Midori's 1990 Carnegie Hall debut, particularly the 10th track on the CD. I remember it very well, the Last Rose of Summer variation. And I was just absolutely blown away by this. Now, in high school, I had the opportunity to perform a Vivaldi duo with Midori at the Merit School of Music. It was another wonderful opportunity they had provided. So I met her, and I knew that she was physically small in stature. Now I'm 6'2". I have large hands. Her hand can almost fit in the palm of my hand. And she was playing this, this repertoire. It's, even on the first page, you're sustaining tenths while using two of your fingers to play pitched left-hand pizzicati on the G and D strings. And I was listening to this recording. I was just blown away that someone with a hand that I knew was, physically weaker than my hand, that was so much smaller, whose arms were so much smaller, I just couldn't gather how it was possible in the first place, and B, how this was possible for her. And so I thought, it can't be in the muscles. It can't be trying to force things to happen. There's something else going on here, and something that I really don't have any idea about. So I kept thinking about this recording, and after a while I found a video on YouTube, and I remember zooming in, and I even took screenshots and zoomed in just to look at her fingers and see what's going on. How is this possible? And what I noticed is that first, it looked easy when she did it. Second, she wasn't exerting any force anywhere where it wasn't absolutely necessary. And so I did some reading, and I found some things from Galamian where it's saying, the maximum amount of pressure you need on the fingerboard was only enough to stop the vibration from happening on the other side of the string. Any more than that is wasted energy, wasted effort, and it slows your hand down, which slows down everything you want to do with your hand. It's a handicap in that way. And it was just a huge revelation to me, and so I started practicing to the other extreme of essentially dropping my bow, and just to practice playing lightly. I put a blanket down in a practice room at the music school, and just because I want to work on playing lightly, so lightly that if I dropped my bow, it wouldn't, mess up my bow. And my left hand posture too, because at that point, I'd only been playing 5.5 years, and I'd already had my fingerboard panned twice. And panning is where you've played so much that you've worn grooves into the fingerboard. Now, someone with good, better technique than I probably wouldn't have ever needed to have a fingerboard panned, and I'd already gone through that twice. And wearing grooves in the fingerboard affects intonation too, because your string goes down 1/10 of a centimeter farther, and it brings the pitch sharp. And so I just started playing extremely lightly. I used the business card trick where if your finger is down light enough, you can keep your finger at the same place on the string with enough pressure to retain the pitch, while sliding a business card under your finger, under the string. Things to discover how lightly I could play while it worked. And immediately what I noticed is that my endurance just doubled, because I'm using less than half the muscles that I had been using. And so that was really the changing point. The recording that changed what I was able to do on the violin. And if I hadn't had that revelation, grad school definitely wouldn't have happened, and I definitely wouldn't be holding a doctorate in violin performance today.
Which you just got recently, by the way. Congratulations.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, the graduation was less than 17 hours ago.
There's so many things I love in your story. I always find it so interesting to hear about someone's path, because I feel like there's so much that can be learned and so many lessons that can be extracted from taking a look at what helps someone get where they are. And I think it is so incredible to hear you talk about how through your own curiosity and searching for answers, you really were able to make it achievable. I feel that sometimes we're all maybe guilty of this. We struggle with something and we wait for answers from someone else. But you really show what can happen when we take ownership of our knowledge and our experience and really search for ourselves. And it's one of the big concepts I try to incorporate in my own practice and probably forget about it too often. But also my teaching is this concept of beginner's mind, of remaining curious and monitoring the basics, remaining I like the word insatiably curious, which sounds a little bit like what you were about figuring out the issues in the playing. But, it takes a village for sure. And you mentioned the merit school and CYSO and your family coming together and those many opportunities that you were offered. But it also takes someone who's driven and puts in the effort and pushes past the obstacles. And I feel like that story you told us is so important for people to hear, that you search for answer and you go in the methodical way to find the answers, and there's no limit to what you can accomplish.
Absolutely true, and I hope that I've lived up to that. What you've just said, it's it's incredibly important, and remaining curious. I think there's a huge difference between just asking questions and asking questions while being curious. Curious, at least, I haven't looked it up probably ever, but it's not just a search for an answer, but it's the desire to have it almost by any means necessary.
Yes.
And that, and like you said, the childlike curiosity. I think, I always, I believe the better that you get at something, it's almost the worse you feel, and not, just in an introspectively way, because you become. It's like the sciences. You get an answer to something, and it reveals more questions. We discovered quantum physics, around the early 20th century, and all of a sudden, all of our, general relativity, and quantum mechanics are incompatible, but they both exist in the universe. And at the theorized beginning of the universe, they had to coexist, and so it brought about even more questions. So, for every question that's answered, you get 5 more questions about that answer.
That's so true.
So it's perpetual, but I think, at the end, whenever, if there even is an ending point, my desire isn't to feel like I have more answers. My desire is to feel like I have more questions. The pursuit of the answer is of answers is the thing to embrace. And the pursuit of the answer that's what practice is, in my opinion. Sometimes I think a lot of our questions, the answer to them is just to pursue the answer itself.
Yes.
And so you don't actually get an objective answer, because especially in the arts, so many answers aren't objective, and they're entirely subjective. So you can say someone has an issue with fourth finger trills, for example. You give them, I forgot which one it was. I think it's like Kreutzer 17. I know there's two versions of Kreutzer, never mind. There's the one that he revised in, it has 42 etudes rather than 40. But anyway, there's a Kreutzer etude. You might give that to someone for fourth finger trills. And the real issue for that individual isn't their fourth finger muscle that the etude works on. It might be their posture with the left hand. Some people have this thing where they fan out their left hand away from the fingerboard as the hand approaches the pinky finger. Mm-hmm. And so reaching the G string with 4 rather than going from the top down is almost like a reach around. And if you're reaching around and trying to trill with anything at the same time, I mean, just thinking about it almost seems silly. That'll never work. Speaking from experience, in the process of finding that out is that's your job. A teacher is a guide, but they guide you to finding your own answers. And I think those are the best teachers.
Well, it's like you say to that, the pursuit of the answer is where you learn, because someone could tell you to use less pressure, but how do you learn to use less pressure unless you're really determined to figure out how it works for yourself?
Exactly. Exactly. Of course, there's so many ways to apply more pressure. I just had this discussion with a student less than an hour ago about the application of pressure, where to apply from. You might want to take some of the pressure off that you're applying subconsciously from your shoulder and put it into your index finger. And every bow stroke and every bow direction will have a different set of muscles that engages for that pressure. And just like fingerprints, no two fingerprints are the same, no two arms are the same. And so this one-size-fits-all approach really doesn't work. We've seen that in the American education system as well. Standard curriculum being issued out has been a failure in the American education system because it's that one-size-fits-all approach.
Yes.
That doesn't work.
And one thing that I find is interesting about your story is because you started so late and had to catch up, I find that it gave you a completely different perspective. You had more maturity at that stage, but also you had the determination to look for these answers that we've been talking about, but to approach the problem solving completely differently. I think that when you start young, the muscle memory is developed, the habits are assimilated really early on. Mm-hmm. And then you end up, when you start an instrument a little bit later, you end up having to really put more intellectual, have a much more intellectual approach to how to incorporate all of these elements in your playing. How does that look for you now? Let's say, for example, you have to work on a very difficult passage in a new piece. What does that look like? You look at this passage and you're trying to learn it.
Well, I completely agree with what you said about, if there is an upside to a late start with starting music, starting a difficult excerpt, there's nothing I can take for granted on the page, so to speak. Most of my music colleagues, in fact, all of them that I'm aware of, and I've talked about this with them a lot, cannot remember a point where they could not read music at all. A lot of them can't remember a point where they didn't know where the G string was or how to reach it with the bow. These are still fresh in my mind because they were well within the last 14 or 15 years.
Incredible.
I started this as a teenager, so I remember looking at a page of music and not knowing what anything on the page said, not knowing what it meant. I remember all of this. And so the process of, while the music is expressive to me, it's something I hope to talk about later, the process is still very cerebral, and everything is very deliberate still. One of my curiosities at this point is Plato spoke about 4 levels of learning. The first is unconscious incompetence, where you're not good at something and you're so not good at it you're not even aware that you're not good at it. The next level is conscious incompetence, where you're aware that you're incompetent or not great at a thing. The next level where I spend a lot of my time is probably the better moments of my time is conscious competence, where you're good at a thing, but you have to be conscious, and it's a conscious effort to be decent at that thing or that technique or that run or that passage. And he said the highest level of learning is unconscious competence, where you can be good at something and not really have to think about it. So tuning is something that we still think about, but we might be able to hit third finger on A, D, hundreds of times in a row, perfectly in tune. And that's kind of, as far as the violin can go, the level of unconscious competence. My curiosity, now I see a lot of child prodigies, especially online, who are literally 7, 8, 9 years old, and playing through the Sfor version of Paganini's first concerto, which is an even harder version than Paganini's his manuscript. Even Kreisler rewrote Paganini's first concerto into a one-movement concerto to make it playable, because he was asked to play it, and he said, "This is too much." But my curiosity is to see if someone can start as a teenager and achieve unconscious competence, the fourth level of Plato's learning table at this point. Unconscious competence is still something I'm striving for, but like I said, I'm curious about it. I think the pursuit of that curiosity is more important and more gainful than actually whether it's reached or not.
That is so good. That is so good. And I love what you say about not taking anything for granted on the page. I often make the reference with my students about how nowadays we look at a website, you go to look up an article, and there's all these ads and buttons and things flashing at us, and we are trained to disregard things and just go to the main information. And I find that sometimes they have the same approach to a manuscript, a piece of music. And I have to remind them that actually on the page, every single marking is important and crucial and must be looked and acknowledged and taken in. So
Absolutely. Yeah, I still have my Suzuki Book 1 where I really didn't take it for granted. I took every single I wrote out every single marking, whether it was a legato line or a slur or a tempo marking or a dynamic. And now the editions I've seen my students come in with now, they all have these glossaries in the back. The one I got back in 2014 didn't have the glossary of all of those things in the back. But I wrote my own out back then, and I would repeat it. I have the composition books where I would try and repeat that table from memory, so I'd actually know what those things meant when I encountered them. And now, like, even at universities and other ensembles, I'm playing beside professionals who aren't aware of these things, or who aren't, or had no idea the difference between a Romantic era and a Baroque era trill, and don't know what these different ornamentation symbols mean. Because this was extremely deliberate and had to be extremely deliberate on my part, it's been to my benefit, I can say, picking up a sheet of music and being deliberately hyper aware of everything that's actually on the page.
And I think it's this word, deliberate, that's key here in your story, because your approach to learning is really deliberate. And that's what I love. And I think that's what transpires when we look at your social media posts, whether it's Instagram or Facebook, and how deliberate you are in your approach to practicing and approaching repertoire. This is really, really great.
Thank you very much. And I try to keep, I learn a lot from teaching. I teach a lot now. And my Instagram's almost up at 20,000 followers, which isn't a lot by a lot of standards, but it's enough for me. So my Instagram is the Violin Doctor. And I started it at the beginning of my doctoral program. And I was hesitant about that Instagram handle because I wasn't a doctor yet, but I also knew that the name would probably be taken if I didn't take it. So I took it. But that was officially made true about 17 hours ago at graduation. I have a program that I run through the stories on Instagram called Ask Immanuel Anything. And so most of those are related to music and specifically violin performance. So how do you do this? How do you do this bow stroke? How do you play the left hand pits, Variation 9 from Paganini? Have you ever played Last Rose of Summer? What do I have to look forward to in this? Because it looks like a walk through hell. So this program has allowed me to share my process with everyone who's been curious about it, and it's been a tremendous help to me to even, like you said, review what your process actually is, so you can actually take it, tweak it, bend it, and keep your process malleable to whatever shape or form you need at the present time.
Yes.
And not to lock yourself into a mode of practice. Because if you lock yourself into a mode, where do you find yourself again? You're right back into zombie mode. That's almost like the human default setting, just because of the way the world and society is structured, to go into zombie mode with a lot of things.
Yes.
And it's corrosive to art.
Corrosive to art. I love that. And I love that word you just used, malleable, because if I go back to the question I asked about a problem passage, and you've mentioned many ways, practicing slowly, turning it around. And if you do lock yourself into a rigid way of practicing a specific passage, let's say a fast run, well, we can do different rhythms on the violin. We could try different bow stroke, isolate the shifts. But if you don't push further and try to come up with new ways to practice it, and for me, I find it fun to just try to ask the question, what else? What else could I try? Or sometimes you get bored with it. You mentioned the Kreutzer etude. If you're struggling with a shift or a trill in the piece, why not pull out an etude that treats the trill and try to work on your trills? I think I've talked about this story before, where I got kind of tired of practicing Schumann 2 scherzo, so I took Kreutzer 9 and practiced it with the dynamics and stroke of Schumann 2. And the Schumann improved, and I had a whole lot of fun while practicing it. And, it's like exactly what you say, to really keep this learning approach malleable. I love it.
Oh, absolutely. It's so helpful. One thing I've done recently is with the prelude to Preludio from Bach's third partita, BVW 1006, in E major, and to start the piece on an up bow, and to do all the bowing as marked in the opposite direction. So we go through this difficult variolage sections, the two and the one that modulates down a fifth on the other side of the page, and all these string crossings and arpeggiations with the opposite bow pattern. The goal is to make it sound at least as good as I had it with starting it on a down bow. And that's a creative thing, because you can take an etude, and the etude kind of doesn't go beyond the scope of, you can make it musical and beautiful. That's kind of the definition of a good etude and good etude practice. But you'll never know the scope of what you can achieve if you're not creative in the same way with your music. So they have to have that conversation to turn your music into a potential etude, and to make your etudes as musical as possible. So I completely agree with what you say about that process of being invariably creative.
Immanuel, you and I have never met, but I certainly hope that you come back to Chicago soon and we can have a long conversation about this kind of stuff.
It would be amazing. I'd really love to. It's my hometown.
I'd love us to do the round of rapid fire questions, but I would really love to say a few words about the Violin Guild, if that's okay with you, because I think it's such an incredible platform. I love that it brings violinists of all backgrounds together in what I feel like is a very safe and supportive environment. You and I talked about it a little bit before we started recording this podcast, but I love how you have professionals, amateurs, students, teachers. It really bridges that gap between the different types of violinists, and everyone comes together and exchanges, asks questions, answer them, offer encouragement and advice and support. For me, I feel like this spirit of community is really where it's at. And I find that I thrive on those exchanges with people who are passionate about music, regardless of whether or not they're professionals or amateur. How do you see how do you see this impacting the future of classical music? What is happening in the Violin Guild?
Sure, sure. Well, I've always had a lot of questions. We had a good section on the topic of curiosity and retaining that childhood curiosity that we have about all parts of a thing rather than just isolated to a specific event. It's one reason why little kids are always seem distracted. They're not distracted, they're just hyper aware. I think there's a big difference. And I have the Violin Guild listed as an educational forum. There are different categories that we can choose, but the goal of the guild had been initially to bring bowed string players together. So we picked the violin because I wanted all bowed strings involved. And the first title I had for it was the String Guild, and more than 50% of the members who were joining were guitarists and a few harpists. And so I thought, okay, this isn't working. And so the Bowed String Guild kind of worked, but kind of didn't, because when you're looking for something to do with the cello or the violin or symphonies or orchestra, as far as strings are concerned, no one ever looks up the term bowed strings. It's terrible on analytics. And so I went with the Violin Guild because they're all instruments of the violin family, and that name worked, at least analytically. And the community got Grammy Award winners in the group. You have Rachel Barton Pine, Chloe Trevor, the wife of Isaac Stern, Joshua Bell, Roman Kim, Jeremy Allen Kittle, the Mad Violinist, Grammy Award winners, and we've also got day one beginners. And what we do, I have a team of administrators now, and I've strongly advocated late starters, and so I didn't want them to feel excluded, and I looked for someone who was interested in helping to administrate the Violin Guild with understanding and empathy for late starters, and I found the CEO of Late Starter Musician, which was a web forum for late starter musicians of all backgrounds, and she took up that mantle and became another administrator, and then Chloe Trevor joined for outreach, and so that the people started coming together and really helping to build this community. And so now we're very, very selective with the exclusivity of the group. The group is for bowed string players. We can trace the violin all the way back to Mongolia and the Morin Kur, and how it worked its way north and became the Iru, and south and became the Sharanhi, and then trade routes brought it to the west, and it started taking on all these really, really interesting shapes, and eventually it takes on a standard shape in Italy as the violin that we play today. And so I invite all bowed string players to this Facebook forum. The goal of it, and how I think it impacts the future, is that our means of interaction, it has to do with globalization. The world is increasingly more globalized and interconnected. A lot of issues that have arisen lately, just in America, for example, a lot of people regard them as new issues, and they're not. It's just we have a means to actually film and record things, and people can actually show what's going on, and anyone can make a YouTube video and reach the entire world in the blink of an eye. actually slightly less time than that. And so there's so much at our fingertips now. It's the number one resource for so much. And people, even concert halls, a significant number of most audiences now for major concert halls is through that concert hall's live stream. And so I think it's why not allow that to be part of the the string communities. It should be a resource for us. And now classical musicians have the somewhat true stigma of being very slow to adapt anything new, whether it has to do with our instruments or our tuning system or our performance attire, you name it. We're just always reputed to be slow to pick up anything new. But I think that this is an essential thing for us to be present in the way that the world connects today. So that's the goal of the guild, and we're structured so that everyone has an equal voice. We don't allow Facebook reacts like the angry emoji. We haven't had one of those, and not a single one in months. We've got rules for how to react to things, and these rules are pretty strict, and our vetting process is strict. Everyone who joins needs to have at least 2 images of them with their instrument. We've had people who just wanted to market through the Violin Guild who Googled an image of a violinist, made it their profile picture, and tried to join. So we say you need at least 2, and we need to see evidence that we're convinced that will convince us that you are a string player. So it's extremely gainful. I know dozens and dozens of musicians who bought not only their instruments, but their cases, their bows. They've gotten advice. I've gotten advice. I've asked for fingerings through the forum. I've asked for suggestions. I've found out about programs. I mean, we met through a similar interaction. Mm-hmm. A number of our audience comes from the Violin Guild. And so I thought with the level of exclusivity that I sought, that the group would just be very, very small and unnoticed. But I think it's the fact that everyone knew that they wouldn't have trolls in the group commenting, that everyone commenting at some level would be a string player, a bowed string player would be responding. And that you'd get responses from all levels of people. We've had people who've made cases for Itzhak Perlman, talking about cases. People who've performed all 24 of Paganini's Caprices in the same concert, giving advice to people picking it up for the first time for their college audition. It's fantastic, and people offer advice when it's asked. And if someone posts a recording just to be appreciated, no one's saying you're this is great but your intonation is terrible. No one's shutting each other down, and the forum doesn't have tolerance for that. So it's just been very great and positive, and we're coming up on 35,000 members, every last one of whom is a string player. And it's gotten to a point where we've got at least a couple members from every major ensemble in the country and outside of the country. So it's been brilliant. Thank you for mentioning it also.
I love it so much because I know that for me it's a big source of inspiration. What you were mentioning about, I love reading the comments when you talk about the professional answering to the questions, and to get other people's perspective on a different technical aspect. And for me, it's always food for thoughts. It's always also a reminder of focusing on the basics, on keeping my own basics sharp. But it's also I'm feeding off this energy that a lot of the amateurs and beginners have, this enthusiasm, that they have this thirst for knowledge. And also just, I love the violin. I love talking about the violin. And if I feel like I can help out someone else, it's really great. I feel like the overall exchange between all of us is so much fun. And again, a big source of inspiration for me. So thank you for creating that, because I feel like it's a very important community that you created. Um, are you ready for a round of rapid fire questions?
Sure, and thank you for the kind words on the Violin Guild. It's facebook.com/groups/the Violin Guild. I'm really grateful that you mentioned it, and your kind words about it mean the world to me. It means that it's doing its job. I'm really grateful for that.
I'll put a link in the show note for it as well.
Thank you.
So, as we've heard, you're a doctor and you're already teaching. So tell us, what does your life looks like now?
Well, right now, like I said, I just graduated a few hours ago. Um, and I've already got a good portfolio career, to use the term of musicologist Mark Clegg, where there's just a lot involved, a lot put together. Every performance major I know at any level is, they're part-time performer, part-time arranger, part-time media social activist, part-time teacher. And that's what my career is already building into. I've got a private studio of 19 students of all levels. My oldest is 73 or 74, and my youngest is 8. And I have a wonderful time teaching them. Because this is my campus town, I've started a freelance work. And I recently played for a theater company called the Scoundrel and Scamp Theater downtown, where I'm also a composer. I hope there's a moment to speak about that, but I'm an active and high output composer, and I wrote over an hour's worth of music for a theatrical work. That's also a huge part of my career and what I'd like to do more of with it. I've written 24 Caprices, 3 fugues for solo violin. I'm finishing my 3rd complete string quartet. That's extremely fulfilling for me. It also allows more music so that everything we play isn't 200 years old. I think current projects I'm in right now, Michael Daphne is a professor from the Fred Fox School of Music at the University of Arizona. He lives in the residence of Camille Hulse, and he was the first music director of the Tucson Symphony Orchestra. And he has started to curate concerts at that home because there's a really nice space for performing. And he's interested in having new music performed in this space, and it's a great opportunity. It pays well, and the musicians are interested. And one thing I really appreciate about writing music and putting it out is, at this point, people are commissioning stuff fairly often and are asking when projects that I'm writing will be completed. I rewrote the Bach Chaconne recently. That was part of my doctoral lecture recital. So I'm just really grateful to have a portfolio career at this point that involves everything I love about music, and it involves so many of my best friends and favorite people that I've met through music.
That's a really good full schedule right there. Emmanuel, what skills do you think young musicians studying today should acquire in addition to learning to play their instruments?
Sure, I can, in a word, I will absolutely say composition. It's been extremely helpful to me, and that's been the model for learning Western music. I always say that music is a language. We read it, we write it, we speak it on our instruments. Those used to all be taught together as you would expect of any language. And like any other language, we use it to express some part of the human experience. Beethoven not only had the musical chops to compose piano concerti, but he also premiered them himself. Same with Mozart, and they conducted symphonies. I think just being well-rounded in the musical language is huge. I learned so much about markings and realizing the process of a composer, helps to be aware of that, hyper aware of that when you're
Yes.
reading what composers write, which is a huge part of what we do as performers, and patterns and what they're using, compositional devices. When I started to write music, it also helped me to memorize things much more quickly. And I think that composition really stemmed also from the deliberation that I had with learning to read music in the first place.
I know it's also on the side note, I know that this was part of your doctoral project, wasn't it? To write additional variations to the Bach chaconne?
Yes, yes. And of course, I've gotten some. It's a controversial thing to do. Bach is Bach is revered, and he's. I mean, if I were to name a favorite composer, it would be Bach without question. I try to have some on every program that I have. I've played everything that he's written for the violin. There's a few of the sonatas that he's written for violin and harpsichord that I haven't. But all the sonatas and partitas and concerti, yes. And with the chaconne, there's been a long tradition, primarily enacted by performer composers, to rewrite music that they perform. And we've seen examples of this. It's been, you can trace it back to 13th and 14th centuries with Leonin and Periton troping Gregorian chants and into organum. And they're rewriting things for their own interpretation of the work. And then you can fast forward, how many was it? 6 centuries to Tchaikovsky and Leopold Auer rewriting, I think it was Leopold Auer, who rewrote the Tchaikovsky violin concerto. No one really heard it until Heifetz premiered that version of it at Carnegie Hall. And then you've got the Spohr and the Kreisler versions of the Paganini first concerto. So we've been rewriting things all the time, but it's part of that. There's a stigma when it comes to Bach because he's our most untouchable and revered composer, but other musicians who aren't bowed string players rewrite Bach all the time. You can look at the guitar versions of the transcriptions for guitar with the chaconne and the Busoni chaconne on piano. And I thought this would be really great to do on the violin, but people complain about it being a transcription. But when you think about it, Bach wrote the thing between 1720 and 1750 in the Kooten Principality, and it had no documented performance whatsoever until 1840 with Mendelssohn. So we actually ended the Baroque era, skipped over an entire era, classical era, and then went into the Romantic era when it was finally played by Mendelssohn. And Mendelssohn, the premiere of the chaconne, was also a recomposition of it. It wasn't the chaconne. He had Ferdinand David on violin, while he wrote an entire accompaniment for forte piano. So that was kind of the beginning of the chaconne and its popularity. I think it's been our institutional structures that have brought string players to think that some music is almost biblical. It's untouchable. You shouldn't mess with it or change a dot or a word in it. Even Galamian gets a lot of scrutiny for changing a lot of the bowings in the music. And Herman's edition, which is probably the most popular version for students, largely due to the fact that it's also the cheapest. He changes a couple of notes in the book. But I wanted to show that this could actually be an expressive thing on the violin. Plus, the violin that we use now is super different from the Baroque violin. And, it was during Bach's lifetime that we started to get standard violin fingerboards, but they likely weren't the ones Bach had used. The ones that were super common and most common had a fingerboard that was 40 millimeters shorter than the standard fingerboard that we've got today. And we're talking instruments that had no chin rest and no shoulder rest and a bow that's bent in the opposite direction and is a good 6 inches shorter. And the strings, that's huge. They're not made out of metal then. They're made out of
cat gut, and that's not the guts of cats, but it is guts. It's the cat's short for cattle, and they use the intestinal lining from cows to make strings. Every pitch on that instrument sounds extremely different from a modern day violin. And so part of the concept of rewriting the chaconne is also to write it for the modern violin, which I regard as a different instrument entirely. And so this was but it was also to use the devices that Bach had used, answering the question, what would Bach have written? What might Bach have written had he had a modern violin to use? And if you're writing for that instrument, and what do I want to express? What do I want to say in the musical language through the chaconne? And is it legitimate to use composition and recomposition as part of the interpretational approach? So my dissertation topic was answering all of these questions, and I performed it. I've got some clips of it up on my Instagram. Full video will go on YouTube as soon as I have a chance to actually sit down.
That's a fascinating topic, and there are big questions to be discussing for sure. Do you have a favorite tool in the practice room?
The metronome, I'm very strong about. It's when I was rehearsing under Gustavo Dudamel during the 2008 CYMI, Chicago Youth Musicians Initiative, I think. He had said, you must realize that no two eighth notes any of you play at any point will ever be exactly the same. So you need to strive extra hard to bring them to as close the same value as possible. And that stuck with me because I hadn't realized that at all at that point. I thought, if an ensemble has two eighth notes, everyone's playing the same value. And no, it's an effort. And again, it has to do with the cerebral involvement with music of not taking for granted that everyone is just playing the same value, that you actually need to put work and effort and mindful playing into your rhythmic divisions of time. And so having a really strong sense of pulse, I think is it's more crucial than I think is regarded in a lot of practice. And I think a lot of professionals, students have the benefit of having someone who constantly reminds them to work with a metronome. When you stop taking lessons, no one's reminding you anymore. You're responsible on your own. And some people, when you start doing the actual music career, some days you get up and it's just, you're becoming a better violinist isn't the first goal. The first goal is like putting food on the table. And so you forget the things that actually keep your skills in check. So yeah, definitely the metronome is my favorite practice tool. There's so much you can do with it. And the metronomes that we've got today are just incredible. You can slow them down to whatever point you want in a piece and then have it speed up through another section. You can have any kind of subdivision. The metronomes that exist now are just incredible, and they're literally hundreds of times cheaper than the Dr. Beats were even when I had started.
Mm-hmm. A great way to put metronome work in perspective. Do you have a piece of advice that was given to you and that you would like to pass on to the listeners?
Of course, sure. I've received so much great advice while playing. I've had the huge blessing of extremely experienced and wonderful, caring teachers. I think of those, the one that would stand out is being mindfully creative in your practice. practice is where, there's a part of the performer where I think we've all experienced, and I hope I'm not just speaking for myself. I'd be really sad. Where we've all experienced where you sound amazing. You sound godly in the practice room, and then you get on stage and you don't sound godly. And I think that there's bridging that gap. My goal is to always be in a frame of mind of performing. Even if I'm practicing, I'm trying to practice my best. Even if that doesn't mean sounding my best. Some exercises defaultedly don't sound good. But I want my process to be of a high quality. So I practice with the energy of being on the stage, and so that when I'm on the stage, I can feel like I do in the practice room, thus marrying that gap. So for performance majors, that's my number one piece of advice, is to let your practice room feel like the stage, so that the stage can feel like the practice room, and you're always in your comfort zone no matter what.
Oh, this is fantastic advice. Thank you. Immanuel, how about a quick actionable tip that listeners could implement today in their musical lives?
To practice in a different way than you've ever practiced before. How different can you make your practice while still aiming to improve? If you don't try different methods of improvement, you lock into one. And again, it's been kind of the theme of what I've been saying, is avoiding zombie mode. There's so much you can do with the piece of music beyond just our rote, changing of rhythms and speeding up the metronome a click a day. What can you do differently? You can start the piece with the bow moving in the opposite direction. You build so many skills from trying it that way. If you have a trill that you've always, you'd say it's a trill that you've always gone to third position with, to trill with your second finger or your third finger, try doing it with the fourth finger. If you don't use it, you lose it. That's the saying. But the truth of it is, you don't use it, you never have it in the first place. You want these things in your arsenal. And even if if it's not something that you use in that piece, in that moment, or in that performance, that technique is then in the arsenal for when you need to use it. You have a trill, you want to turn it into a double trill, but you just don't, because it's not there and it's not in the music, so you don't need to do it. The goal of music, at least in my opinion, isn't to play what's on the page. It's to communicate. What do you want to say? And you won't even know what you can say if you're not creative in the practice. So I heavily encourage everyone. I'm encouraging myself at the same time as I'm saying it, to practice in a different way that you have before, while keeping your same goals in mind.
That's really awesome. Thank you. Immanuel, you've touched on so many important topics today, and you're such an inspiring person and musician. Thank you so much for sitting down with me and chatting today.
Oh, thank you. Thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it. I hope to be on the show again sometime. And you have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you guys so much for listening. I really hope you enjoyed this conversation with Dr. Immanuel Abraham. I personally am completely in awe of his unwavering determination, and I'm feeling really inspired by his approach. If you've listened to all the episodes of the podcast, you know I love to chat, and I would love to chat with you. So before you go, snap a screenshot as you're listening to this week's episode and tag me on Instagram using the handle MindOverFinger. I always love to see who's listening, and that way I can share your screenshot on my story. As always, you can find the show notes for this episode and resources on mindful and deliberate practice at mindoverfinger.com. You can also visit ImmanuelAbraham.com for all the details about Immanuel's career and upcoming performances. If you're looking for a community of mindful practice enthusiasts, join the Mind Over Finger tribe at facebook.com/groups/mindoverfingertribe. We're a super supportive community, and with us, you'll find inspiration, motivation, and discussions on how to take your practice to the next level and enjoy the process. I also want to say a huge thank you to those of you who have left reviews on iTunes. I read every single one of them, and it means the world to me. This podcast is truly a passion project for me, and your kind words make it all worthwhile. Your reviews also help people find the podcast. So if you've enjoyed this episode and feel like it brought some value to you, please do me a favor and hop over to iTunes to write a few words. As I said, it means the world to me, and I truly appreciate it. Next week, I'll be talking with cellist David Eby about the power of mindfulness and meditation in both practice and performance. Again, thank you, and à bientôt!